This three-stone basket-style mounting looks like an easy project to complete, but it takes precise craftsmanship to make this mounting evenly proportioned and have everything straight and symmetrical. There's no room for mistakes. It must be measured and executed accurately. To begin, open the diamond paper for the side stones and measure them. We need exact measurements to make this mounting. Both of the stones measured 5.1 millimeters. Next, open the diamond paper for the center stone and measure it. It measures right at 7 millimeters. The under bezels are made from 1.2 millimeter round wire. Using a round nose and flat nose combination plier, bend a circle and measure it. We want this to be about 10 to 15% smaller than the diamond. Once we get to the right size, cut straight through the jump ring to form the under bezel for the center stone. For the side stones, wrap the wire one time around the plier's jaws. Using a pair of flat nose pliers, we can adjust the size of the ring. Then wrap the wire around the pliers to get the second ring. This method assures us that we will have the correct size and both rings are exactly the same size. Then cut through the jump rings to separate them for the under bezels for the side stones. Forming the under bezels can also be accomplished by measuring the length needed and bending the wire around and soldering together, but I find this method works just as well and sometimes is more accurate. Using 1500 platinum solder, solder the three rings closed. Some jewelers prefer to place the pallium of solder in the seam and heat it. I like using a solder pick to apply the solder to the jump rings. 1700 solder could be used here, but these solder seams will be covered and the hotter temperature solder is not necessary. Next, place the rings on a round bezel mandrel and using the nylon face on a hammer, straighten the rings. You do not want to use a steel or brass-faced hammer because you do not want to nick or mar the outside of the rings. The little round notch in my bench pin helps hold the rings, and I can push forward on the mandrel and slide it into the rings as I'm hammering to help straighten them. Next, carefully file a flat spot on each of the two side under bezels. File the flat spot right over the solder seam, as then it will be to the inside and will not show. On the center under bezel, file two flat spots directly opposite each other. It is extremely important that the two flat spots are centered and on exact opposite sides. If it's off just a little bit, you'll never get the three rings to line up straight. Next, solder the three rings together. There's a variety of ways you could do this. I like to just lay the center under bezel on my platinum soldering board and hold the side jump ring in a third hand. This way I can line up the proper angle for the sides. I again used 1500 solder to solder these together and just lay a little pallium of solder on the seam. Once you solder the two rings together, turn it around and line up the second side stone under bezel in the same manner as the first one. Heat it until the solder flows across and you have the three rings soldered together forming the under bezel. Once they're soldered together, check to make certain they're straight. I like using graph paper that I can lay the rings on to see if they're straight. You can also place it in the parallel jaws of a millimeter gauge and close the gauge down on the center under bezel. Then examine to see if the gap on the two sides of both rings are equal. Then you know that your three rings are lined up properly. Next, take a piece of 1 millimeter thick by 6 millimeter wide stock and bend round to the finger size needed. This will form the bottom bezel. First, set your dividers to 3 millimeters to mark off the center line, and then mark off a section that will form the bottom of the airline on the shank and an area that will overlap the shank. Here we're using 7 millimeters. Next, mark the radius of the side stone bottom bezel. It should be about 10 to 15% smaller than the under bezel. Here we're making them 4 millimeters, so we set the divider to 2 millimeter, and then use a graver to mark the center, and then place the dividers on the mark and draw the circle. Then mark off the center stone, which is 6 millimeters. Draw another 4 millimeter circle for the other side stone, and then mark off the 7 millimeters for the airline. The size of the under and bottom bezels depends on how tall you want the crown and how steep of an angle you want the prongs. There is no standard size that you must adhere to. Their size are dependent upon your personal preference and feel for the project you are making. Once we have the bottom bezel laid out, cut the piece to length. Then hold the under bezel over it to make certain everything lines up and is proportioned correctly. Next, we need to make the shank. For this project, we're using 1.5 millimeter thick stock, 3 millimeters wide. We bent it round on a bench-mounted ring bender, and using the nylon-faced hammer, straighten it out on a ring mandrel to make certain it is even and is the correct size. Next, lay the strip that we made for the bottom bezel on the ring stick and mark the side of the shank where it overlaps. Then, using these round nose bending pliers, make a sharp bend right on the mark. Then continue that bend outwards on the shank. The shank is longer than needed, and one side is longer than the other, but that doesn't matter as we will trim them at a later time. Then place the shank back onto the ring stick and check to make certain it is still round and even up to the marks. Then cut from the inside of the shank approximately halfway into the shank to begin creating a notch for the bottom bezel to fit into. Use the thickness of the saw blade as a guide to watch how far you're cutting. You want to cut a little past the point where the back of the saw blade is flush with the surface of the metal. Next, cut down on an angle to the cut that you just made, creating a wedge-shaped notch in the shank. Make this cut on both sides, forming a wedge-shaped notch on the inside of the shank for the bottom bezel to fit into. Next, use the edge of a half-round file to get down into your notch, and then using the rounded side of the file, slightly round off the sides of the notch. The bottom bezel is curved to match the finger shape, and so you need to curve the notch for it to fit into tightly. Next, solder the bottom bezel in place. Place it in the notches, and the tension of the shank should hold it in place. Use 1700 solder to solder this seam closed. The reason we're using 1700 is because we do not want the solder seam to show. This is very critical. When the ring's all done and you do the final polish, if the solder seam shows, it will distract from the professional look of the ring. You want this to look like it's one solid piece of platinum. Once the inside of the shank is soldered, I lay the shank down on my solder pad, and if necessary, add a little solder on the sides to make certain the seam is solid. Once it's cooled down, pick up the ring and examine it. Examine both solder seams on both sides, in the center of the airline, and the inside of the finger hole. Make certain solder has flowed all the way around and it is a solid solder seam. Next, we need to clean up the shank. I begin with a half-round file and clean up the inside. Because we used a 1 millimeter piece on the bottom bezel and 1.5 millimeter piece for the stock on the shank, and we notched the shank about halfway through, about 1/4 millimeter sticks up on the inside of the ring, and that needs to be filed smooth. Then place the ring onto a ring mandrel and shape it round. If it's not quite the right size, use a steel hammer to tap it up. I'm a little over 4 3/4 and I need a size 5, so I tap it up to size. Then on a small bench block, tap the sides lightly to even out the shank and make certain it is flat and smooth. Next, we need to start to form our bottom bezel. Begin by sawing along the side of the shank. Be careful not to saw into the shank. You just want to cut the piece of metal for the bottom bezel even with the side of the shank. Cut that piece out on all 4 sides, being very careful that your saw blade does not drift into the shank. You want to cut the sides as smoothly as possible, right up to the circles you drew for the first side stone. Then, using a flat file, blend that piece into the shank. Once this is filed, it should look like one solid piece of metal. There should be no evidence of the solder seam or that it is 2 pieces of metal soldered together. Next, measure the length of the fingers on top. I like the length of the short side, and so I'm going to make the long side the same length. Cut that extra metal off at this time to get the extra metal out of the way for notching the rest of the bottom bezel. Next, I use a saw and begin to shape the bottom bezels. Cut a little V-notch in between the circles. At this point, I'm not concerned about cutting a perfect circle. I can shape that with my file later. The reason we left the metal solid until now is because once we got it all soldered together, we could move the circles over a little bit if they were not perfectly centered. If I was to saw them out, file them to shape, and pierce the circles, and then solder them in, there's a chance that it would not be perfectly centered, and then our ring would not line up correctly. Use a needle file to form the 3 circles to the correct size and shape, making certain they are proportioned properly. Then, using a 1.2 millimeter drill bit, drill the holes on the center marks of each circle. Then, using a cone-shaped burr, open up the holes. I want the metal left in the circles about 1 to 1.2 millimeters thick. That'll give us plenty of strength across the bottom of the stones along the finger, and it's a good size to give a nice look to the ring. Carefully cut each of the holes, and then use a bud burr on the inside to cut a slight taper to the holes to clean any burrs left from drilling and to leave a clean edge on the holes. Next, use 1500 white diamond platinum polish on a small felt wheel to polish the top of the bottom bezel. The next step will cover this area, and we will not be able to polish it later. If we were careful in forming it, there will not be any deep scratches or marks to remove, so we can go straight to the polishing compound. A dental flosser that you can buy at the drugstore used for cleaning your teeth can be used to polish in areas that cannot otherwise be reached. Put the diamond compound on the floss and stroke it through the crevices.